Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing our reading of Imagination and Invention. We got to the bottom of page 22, I believe, last time. So we're going to pick up from there. So we're still reading the introduction, and we're on part B of that introduction. So we're looking at this. So the section title is The Hypothesis of the Genetic Dynamism of the Image, Phases and Levels. So he's giving us these sort of, he has two sort of nested hierarchies of types of images that are part of this process of development of images, or this cycle of images, as he describes it. So we've gone through the first sort of cycle, the first level, or I don't know how to differentiate these two parts of the account he's developing here, but we have a three-part cycle, which is in turn sort of repeated at three stages in a second three-part cycle. So for the first cycle, we have a set of phases, what he calls phases of the genesis of the image. So we have the phase that comes before experience, so the anticipation. So you have an image that you sort of imagine of an object before you actually come into contact with that object. And he connects this also with ethological concepts, so concepts having to do with animal behavior. And he talks about so there's this concept of the Leerlaufreaktion, which is a sort of empty empty behavior. So animals, certain animals that have a characteristic behavior like catching prey or eating in a certain way or drinking or whatever in a certain way. If they have sort of an intense enough motivation, if they're hungry or thirsty or whatever, they will perform that behavior even without the actual object that corresponds to it. So they will sort of act as though they were eating something, even though there's no food there. And this sort of empty behavior is what Simondon connects with this notion of anticipation. So it's as if the animal is sort of hallucinating the object of the behavior before having actually experienced that object. And then the second phase is the phase of perception, or of interaction with the object in the presence of that object. So here the image is connected with the object. So we can think here of just perception in general, but there's a sort of feedback process between the image as I experience it and the object. So there's a kind of constant correction of the image to better depict the object. What else? So, and then, I didn't mention, yes, so he describes the first phase as an a priori phase. So again, this is prior to the image, prior to the object. And then the second phase he calls it a presenti, which is a term that he sort of invents by analogy with the terms a priori and a posteriori. And we also saw this in individuation. He used this term. And then finally, the third phase is what he calls the affective emotional effect or resonance. So here, and this is the a posteriori phase. So we can think of memory or reminiscence in particular here, but he specifies that not all memories are images. So we can think, so it's not just when you sort of remember what you had for breakfast yesterday, a sort of banal, not really significant memory. That's not an image necessarily. It's when you, say, remember what your childhood home looked like, or something that has an emotional or affective resonance for you. And this type of image has a sort of structuring effect on the whole universe of images that make up your mental life. So by recalling these types of affectively powerful images, you sort of orient your whole mental life around these types of images. You like yes, and that's a good example that he mentions in that passage is a conversation. And so not just a when you stopped in the hallway and talked to your neighbor about the weather or something like that, but an important conversation where you maybe made a decision about that changed the course of your life, for example. You might remember it. You don't remember sort of word for word what that conversation was, but you might remember, um, a few keywords and the tone of voice that you used and the other person used, and a sort of affective tone of the whole conversation. That's sort of how you remember that conversation, as opposed to having like a transcript of the actual words used. And so, yeah, that's the third phase of this process. And then he says we have these three phases, and then we have invention, which is a sort of like a change of gear that pushes the cycle up to a new level. So that we have three phases, and then invention is a sort of fourth phase or transition to a new instance of the cycle at a higher level. So it's a sort of spiraling structure where you have a cycle type structure, but it repeats at higher and higher levels. And then he passes from the set of phases, the first three-part hierarchy that he describes, to a description of the levels. So the second three-part hierarchy. And so we looked at the first two phases, or the first two levels, sorry, of that hierarchy last time, and we'll continue with the third one this time. And so he he describes the first level as being biological or vital. So in this, at this level, we're dealing with responses of the whole organism. So in the case of anticipation, we have behaviors of the organism, like he describes aggression or flight as being sort of characteristic of this level. So the organism will respond as a whole. It either runs away or attacks or whatever. This is a sort of biological anticipations or anticipation at the biological level. And then perceptual experience. So the second phase at this level has to do with what he describes as innate forms or patterns. So it's a kind of grasping of a situation in terms of these sort of vitally relevant meanings. So you perceive something as potential food or potential mate or potential predator or whatever. Each sort of instance of perception or each object of perception is understood in terms of its relevance to some sort of biological behavior. And then finally, the third phase at this level, the resonance phase, has to do with learning. And here's the sort of translation issue that I've mentioned before. They translate the word apprentissage as apprenticeship, so that would be a sort of specialized situation. I think what Simondon has in mind is the more general term learning, because he's talking about animal behavior here, and animals in general don't undergo apprenticeship. So we can describe animals as learning. And that's what the resonance phase sort of consists in at this level. So animals will learn that, like a newborn goose or duck or whatever will learn what its mother looks like, and they have this imprinting process where they sort of grasp the image of their mother as the sort of structuring principle that they are directing their behavior around. So that's the first level, the biological level. And then the second level is what he calls the psychological level. But he says this term is far from satisfactory. But what this level has to do with is a kind of response that is less immediate than the biological level. So you can, at the psychological level, it's not the whole organism that either runs away or attacks or whatever. It's a sort of partial response where you can take in information about the world and evaluate things and make decisions and so on. So the anticipation is here at this level. Anticipation has to do with what he calls motivation and desire. So here you can the individual, and here he's thinking primarily of a human individual. You can be aware that you have a particular desire that you want to, I don't know, take the last cookie or whatever. I'm taking a kind of silly example, but you might have a desire to take the last cookie, but then decide, it's better not to do that. But you're still aware of that desire, so you sort of are oriented towards that desire, but you decide not to act on it. And then the second phase, the experience phase, is a grasp of objects that is not directly tied to their relevance for biological categories of behavior. So you're not just perceiving something as a food source or as a mate or whatever. You can analyze the object and you can determine what its properties are. You can say this apple has a particular color and shape and so on, and not just view the apple as something to be eaten. And then the third phase, the affective emotional symbol of the object. So here, so this is where he brings up this example of the conversation. So the conversation is your sort of recollection of a conversation is a good example of this psychical image in the third phase. So you are you're not just learning something sort of unconsciously. You're not just becoming imprinted by a particular image, but you here we can think of episodic memory, which seems to be more or less specific to human beings, although there's some controversy about that. But here, so episodic memory means memory of a particular occasion and not just learning a category or behavior. And so human beings are capable of remembering, you can remember what your, sixth birthday party was like or whatever. You remember a particular occasion, as opposed to just remembering, like other animals are capable of learning how to respond to a particular situation, what types of behaviors are appropriate. But in general, they don't seem to remember particular occasions the way that we do. And so that here's the distinction between that learning at the first level and episodic memory at the second level. So that's about where we ended up at the second level of the 3-level hierarchy. So we'll pick up on the third level of the hierarchy today and continue from there. So if I can get someone else to read from the bottom of 22, finally, there may also be.
I can start us off. Finally, there may also be a third level of the activity of images that must be called formal, or in a certain sense reflexive, because they operate systematizations effectuated from the point of view of the subject dominating its relation to the milieu. As anticipation, the a priori image appears under the form of a motor intuition, a projection schema issued from an active center of spontaneity and radiating towards the plurality of situations or objects. Such intuitions are found in the principle of philosophical doctrines like Platonism, Plotinus's doctrine, or that of Bergson's élan vital. Through reflexive intuition, the subject identifies with the singular and unconditional source of projection, of procession, or evolution. The subject returns at the level of ideas to the absolute origin of present existence and experience and operates a pure anticipation. This same level of formal activity manifests itself in the modality of present experience through an abstract schematization of classification, impelled by an analogical transfer from level to level, as one sees at work, for instance, in the application of the hylomorphic schema. In this case, the monism of a priori intuition is opposed by the permanent duality of two heterogeneous principles taken together. The reciprocal situation of matter and form is comparable to the exogenous input of incident information, coming from the milieu, informed by the local activity that confers a unity upon it. Finally, if the implicit logic of a priori images provides the primitive model of intuitive reflexivity, while that of intraperceptual images is the trigger of an inductive or deductive systematization, the world of a posteriori images seems indeed to be the principle of amplifying reflexivity, capable of ideally reconstructing the genesis of events and their history from a limited number of reference points endowed with a specific valence. It is this type of organization of images as an analogon of the universe that takes place in philosophical systems of a dialectical kind. They presuppose as a source of intelligibility and development a complex experience whose origin comes from historical situations.
You can continue to the next paragraph. It's just a short one.
Sketch of a link between reflexive modes and the activity of images, taken as a non-exhaustive example of the formal level of such activity, aims not only at foregrounding the relativity of intuition, of discourse, or of dialectical thought, but also at showing that none of these three systematizations fully coincides with the activity of invention, which is too unstable to serve as a paradigm. At a less elevated level of formalization, the a priori activity of images is deployed in the various kinds of initiation-based thought, while their a posteriori use fuels the structuring of figurations and myths with broad collective meaning. In this sense, the study of the image could be directed towards the analysis of cultural contents.
Right, thanks. So he describes this third level as the reflexive level. So he's thinking here of philosophy in particular, but any sort of reflection on life or the first two levels. So a reflection on biological life, just sort of the animal behavior of an organism, and then also reflection on psychological life. So this third level sort of in the same way that the second level is a kind of holding back of the immediate response. The first level, you just sort of find yourself acting, you either run away or attack or whatever without having any reflection or decision making. The second level, you sort of step out of the situation to some extent, and you have some capacity to observe the properties of objects without having tying them directly to a particular vital response, and so on. And then this third level is even more sort of removed from the situation or more abstract in that sense. It's you're now capable of reflecting on your own activity and having this sort of image of that activity. And so the first stage at this level is this image of a kind of outward movement, a kind of sort of central principle out of which everything else is generated through this kind of outflowing or we have all these different images in different philosophers. We have procession, projection, etc. But they all sort of convey this same sort of image of something that overflows and pours out and produces everything else through this overflowing. And this is the sort of motor intuition of anticipation at this level. So you sort of depict yourself as being this principle that overflows and passes over to all the sort of subordinate stages of the procession. And then the second one, the second phase at this level is one where you have two principles. So we can think of again at the second level, you have the object and the organism as sort of opposed poles of the experience. Now, at the third level, in the domain of reflection, we have again sort of two principles, and we understand everything. Our depiction of reality is one in which we have these two principles that interact with each other to produce entities. And so here he's thinking primarily of the hylomorphic schema that we find systematized in Aristotle. So the doctrine of matter and form. So entities are composed of a particular form that sort of structures a certain kind of matter. And so this is a sort of instance of the second level of, the second phase of the third level of this reflective level. And he describes this as having to do with inductive and deductive thought. So you any sort of thought that classifies using concepts that are organized into a sort of hierarchy. So you either, it doesn't matter which sort of direction you either ascend or descend this hierarchy. So you might observe certain creatures or certain entities that you see around you, and you form the concept of a tree, and you subsume that concept of tree under a more general concept of plant, and so on. That's one. So that's the inductive direction of thought, or the other way would be the deductive direction, where you have a concept of a tree, and you would sort of apply this concept to some entity that you come across, and you say, because this entity is a tree, it has properties X, Y, and Z. So that's those two directions of thought are both part of this third phase. This second phase of the third level. And then finally, the third phase of the third level, so the third reflexive, third moment of the reflexive level is what he calls the dialectical schema. So here it has to do with taking something that has already come about or something that already exists and sort of recreating it in thought. And so that he's here thinking of Hegel's famous line about how the owl of Minerva only spreads its wings at dusk. So Hegel argues or states that philosophy can only ever sort of retroactively understand something that has already occurred. You can't kind of sort of anticipate the future using philosophy. You can't sort of predict that certain events will occur because of this philosophical circumstance or whatever. It's only once reality has reached a certain stage that philosophy can grasp that stage of reality. So that's the third phase, and then he points out that this is a sort of relativization of dialectics. So he doesn't take dialectics to be a kind of universal logical structure of the world in the way that Hegel more or less does, depending on how exactly you want to interpret him. But instead, dialectics is one sort of domain, or is the logic or the structure of one domain. Is the structure of this third phase of the third level. So dialectics has a sort of limited validity or a limited relevance to this one domain, but it's not a universal kind of structure. And again, none of these modes of grasping the world are universal. So neither the sort of procession anticipation image in the first phase, nor the opposition of principles in the second phase, nor this dialectical construction in the third phase is sufficient in itself to grasp all of reality. And then he also points out that there's no sort of correspondent to the image here. We don't have to invention here. We don't have an image that corresponds to the invention phase or the invention sort of step from one cycle to the next. And he says invention is too heterogeneous to have a sort of correspondent here. So invention is again something that is or unstable. It doesn't like have a certain structure that we can describe in this very schematic way like the other phases do. So I think that's sort of the main content of this this passage that we just read.
Sorry about that. I'm having problems with my mic. I don't know what's going on. So
yeah, I can hear you now. It sounds good.
Okay, good, thanks. So the third level, he talks about being reflexive. It's formal and reflexive. But in my mind, kind of has a relation to the psychological. So they operate systematizations. And I think the word systematizations is another word for structure. Structural. Often it's structures situated from the point of view of the subject. So it's kind of from the point of view of the subject. There is a systematization in process. So as in anticipation, the a priori image appears under the form of a motor image. So again, what this motor intuition, the image appears under the form of a motor intuition. And what do we understand by motor intuition? I'm interested to know.
Yeah, so I think the way I would understand here, a motor intuition is a kind of image of a movement that you would perform. So this, and again, this is at a very abstract level, as opposed to at a less abstract level, you can of course have an image of you can sort of imagine what it's like to ride a bike or to tie your shoes or whatever, some sort of motor action. You can sort of go through it in your head, as we say. You just sort of close your eyes and imagine. And a lot of athletes actually do this as a sort of practice method. They like visualize, shooting a free throw or doing a tennis serve or whatever. So you have this sort of motor image of a concrete physical action, but we also have this more abstract sort of motor image or motor intuition of sort of the feeling of expansiveness, where this is something that maybe certain kinds of music might produce this kind of feeling in you, or I don't know, reading a poem or whatever, some sort of artistic experience, you might have a feeling of like sort of a sort of image or feeling of expansiveness, as if you were sort of, coming outside of yourself. You sort of expand outside of your limited physical body, and you feel as if you were overflowing with energy or vitality or something along those lines. So this is the sort of abstract motor image, which is behind the first phase of this third level. This image of procession, as if the principle of reality was this kind of overflowing entity that produces everything by coming outside of itself in that way.
So he says that this motor intuition schema. So the schema, it kind of it relates to something. I would say. I think that's my understanding of schema. Issued from an active, it comes from somewhere and it goes towards somewhere. It's a center of spontaneity and radiating towards the plurality of situations. So have this kind of projection structure. What I'm trying to understand is, because I think there is a strong structural element to this, trying to kind of understand because I think there is the kind of level of kind of theoretical, there's also a kind of structural element that seems to be underpinning this, and it's just trying to get to an understanding of that. So it's a kind of thing that the center and radiates outwards towards the plurality of situations or objects. Such an intuition I found the principle of philosophical doctrines like Platonism, Bergson's Elam Vital. So he said there is this kind of objective element within philosophy through reflexive intuition. Yeah, I think then he goes into a more detailed, more explanation of that. He said, through reflexive intuition, the subject identifies with the singular and unconditional source of projection. I think there is a subject identifies with the singular and unconditional source of procession or evolution. We've got projection, procession, or evolution, all ideas of movement, I would say, types of movement.
Yeah, so here, so like in Plotinus, for example, you have the one or the good, this principle of everything, which, so in thought, so the way Simondon is describing Plotinus's thought here is that we sort of in thought put ourselves in the place of this principle we put ourselves in the place of the one, and it's as if we sort of create reality or everything other than this principle by undergoing this kind of movement of expansion. So that's the sort of image that we have of reality, of the genesis of reality, is through situating ourselves at this central point, at this, we identify ourselves with this principle of the one, and then we sort of expand outside of ourselves or overflow ourselves and produce everything, all the different limited individual beings through this kind of self-expansion or self-overflowing. So that's the kind of very abstract schematization that Simondon sees at work in Plato and Plotinus, and then also Bergson. So I think maybe the structural element that you were pointing to here is, identifying this same kind of abstract motor schema at work in different philosophers, and taking it to be, this same schema is at work in these different philosophers, even though they might use different images or different arguments to sort of make this schema seem plausible, but they all use this same schema, or the same schema is sort of behind their thought, even if they aren't fully aware of it.
I think that this movement to from the instinctual to kind of increasing degrees of remove and reflexivity, I see that as being related to the idea in Individuation Volume 1 that moving from one domain of individuation to another is a matter of slowing down the process of individuation. So like the physical individuation slows down and crystallization happens more slowly for the vital individual. And I think something similar maybe is happening in the distinction between the third phase at the instinctual level and then the third phase at the philosophical level. It's maybe can be seen as just a much slower happening of the same kind of process.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. Again, so for those who maybe haven't read individuation, so yeah, he describes and he's used this term, I believe, in this text as well, the neoteny or neotenization of um, of the process of individuation. So in crystallization, so in physical individuation, the individuation is a more or less instantaneous process, or at least a very quick process. The formation, the transformation from the liquid phase to the crystalline phase happens instantaneously at the border of the crystal, and then once that individuation is done, the crystal is just a sort of dead, inert kind of thing that doesn't really do anything on its own. It's just it's the result of a process of individuation, but it's not itself active or it doesn't undergo any process after that individuation. And then at the level of vital individuation, you instead have the way he describes it is as if the crystallization process were slowed down to the scale of the lifespan of an organism. So the organism is constantly undergoing individuation and is constantly in the process of individuating, as opposed to just being a product that is created and then just sort of subsists in its state after that individuation. So and then psychical individuation would be a further sort of slowing down of vital individuation. And we have the same type of sort of schema or the same type of argument going on here in this text. So we have the first level is this vital insertion into the situation where the organism just sort of responds immediately to the situation with a particular sort of behavior that is relevant to that situation. And then the second phase is the second level. I keep mixing those up. The second level is the psychological level, where the organism now has the capacity to not just respond immediately, but to sort of weigh alternative courses of action and to determine which response is the best one. So you have different images that the organism can now compare with each other and make a decision. And so there's a sort of slowing down of that response to the situation. Instead of that immediate response, now we have a sort of deliberate response. And then the third phase is even more removed because it's not connected to any specific situation at all. It's this very abstract sort of reflection on activity as such. So we are not just deciding what to do in a particular situation, but we're, for example, evaluating moral principles in general. So we're evaluating which principles we want to use in all of our decisions. So this type of reflexive thought is even more abstract and even less immediate than the second level. So it's this kind of hierarchy in terms of sort of how closely tied the activity in question is to the situation.
I just like to get something clear. So the overall, we're talking about images. So I guess how we talk about kind of images that we form, we act, and images we form internally to ourselves. Is the idea that's been developed here overall.
Sorry, you cut out again.
Okay, listen, I'm just gonna. I'll stop because it's a bit pointless.
Oh, well, the other option is if you want to switch. I think you're using voice to talk now. If you want to switch to what's the other mode? Keyboard activated or whatever, where you just hold down a button. I think that might work better. Although it's kind of annoying to hold down a button whenever you want to talk. But if you go into the settings, you should be able to switch to the other mode, and that might work a bit better because I think it's the volume gate is it's just a threshold that's too low or too high, sorry, and then it's sort of cutting out individual words or parts of words. So yeah, if you can find that in the settings, then maybe you can just hold down a button and then the mic shouldn't cut out every time you go under that threshold. Okay, so maybe while you're looking at those settings, we can go on to the next bit and and then hopefully you can get that sorted out. So let's go on to section C of the introduction. And then, so if someone could read that first little sentence or a couple sentences, and then the subsection 1, the whole subsection 1. You want to go from there?
Yeah, I can read. C, the fields of application of the notion of genetic cycle of the image exterior to the individual. In nature, we observe that cyclical activities tend to synchronize, that is, to become attuned to recurring phenomena apt to interfere with them. And we observe such synchronizations in the genetic becoming of mental images. Subsection 1, synchronization with the circadian rhythm. The alternation of days and nights modulate human activity in varying degrees, depending on lifestyle, degree of urbanization, etc. To a certain extent, each day takes on the appearance of a complete cycle that carries along a continuous variation in predominance of this or that category of images. The images of evening coming home after the day's intense activity are those of memory. The involuntary evocation of the past may acquire enough relief to evince aberrations out of the images of lost ones. Situations experienced a long time ago or recently recur and take on a new life. The day, and more broadly life, is recapitulated when action ceases or relaxes. Its chapters are to images and faces. The past becomes systematized, ordering itself in sets according to an emotive affective topology qualified by regret or satisfaction. By contrast, the first lights of dawn chase away this crowd of images from the past. After sleep and before activity begins, the anticipations of movement, images that are but projects and triggers of realization are predominant. It is the time when the individual feels the most pressingly what motivates his actions and that he is the origin of his behavior. Experiencing a sense of freedom in the inchoate phase of his relationship to objects, the day's perspectives project like rays diverging from a single center, focus, and source. Future action is envisioned in an a priori mode, and the encounter of real objects arises and orders itself within the amplifying expansion of the project. The unity of motor intuition structures the anticipation of the activity. The direct relation to the milieu when one is working corresponds instead to images that are the most directly inserted into perception. Finally, night is the time of a cycle change, wherein changes of structure sometimes occur, which represent major or minor inventions that lead to seeing situations under a new light. One, quote unquote, sleeps on it, as the saying goes, because night reveals solutions that did not appear to belong to the waking world. So it seems pretty obvious what he's doing here is just going through the three phases that he's set up in the previous section in relation to the first of a series of natural cycles. I think it's interesting that sleep is associated with invention.
Yeah, so just at the beginning of this, so the first little stump, I guess, at the beginning of the section before the subsection. So he says that essentially we have natural cycles tend to synchronize with each other. So you can think of the way that certain plants will open and close their flowers or their leaves depending on the cycle of the sun, or animal migrations happen in accordance with the cycle of the seasons and so on. So you have all these sort of natural cycles that synchronize with each other. And we have the cycle of images that we've looked at in the previous section. And then he says, is this cycle synchronized with other natural cycles? And his answer is yes. So he's going to look at a few different natural cycles, but the first one is the cycle between day and night. And this is probably something that and as he says here, it depends on the sort of mode of life and especially the degree of urbanization. So of course, in our society, where we have electric illumination, we are less tied to the day-night cycle than say medieval Europe, where the day-night cycle was, of course, extremely important. So I think we even have people that, of course, work the night shift, and so their active hours are precisely the night hours, and they rely entirely on artificial illumination. But I think for those of us whose life is sort of more or less tied to the day-night cycle. I think these sort of sketches that Simondon gives are pretty accurate. Like, at least for me, I know, first thing in the morning, or at least once I've had my coffee, you always think about, what kinds of, you have sort of ideas for all kinds of things you want to do that day. All kinds of possibilities sort of open up to you, and you feel sort of energized by these potential actions that you might perform. And then when you actually are sort of going about the day's activities, whether it's work or school or household chores or whatever, you're sort of inserted into a situation. You're interacting with the world. You're at this second phase of the cycle. You're in contact with objects, and then maybe in the evening, especially, but any time where you're not sort of directly active, you're not directly involved with objects, you tend to sort of let your mind wander, as we say. So you might think about something that happened last week, that I should have said this instead of that, or something like that. You just sort of uh, think about situations, and they might be recent situations or something from your childhood, or it might be something that you're just imagining, as we say. You just sort of think of a fantasy situation, but you sort of are less tied to the situation in which you find yourself, but you sort of think about yeah, all kinds of situations that are not specific to the one where you actually find yourself. And then, yeah, the last bit is about invention happening during sleep. And this is an interesting one. This is something that actually, just a few months ago, I read a text by Henri Poincaré, who was one of the great mathematicians of the early 20th century, or late 19th, early 20th century. He described what he describes this as being characteristic of his own research process, where he sort of has a particular problem that he's working on, and he sort of sits down to attack the problem, and he works through all kinds of different situations related to that problem, and combinations of techniques and so on. But he can't really, he feels like he's not making any progress. And then he goes to bed, or he goes to the theater, or does something completely unrelated, and then he suddenly on the way home, or when he wakes up the next morning, he suddenly feels like, oh, I know how to solve the problem, and he sits down at the desk and he just sort of writes the solution. And he says that this is sort of characteristic of his mode of work, where he finds that it's only after you actually sort of systematically work through a project, but then afterwards you have this phase of invention that is sort of unconscious. You are not sort of aware of what's going on. You might even be completely asleep, but then you wake up and you have the solution just sort of appears. You just sort of know what to do. And so that's what the type of situation that Simondon has in mind here, where you work on a problem and you have a sort of limited perspective. You only see potential solutions A, B, and C, and then you go to sleep and you wake up, and then finally you realize, oh, actually it was D all along that solves the problem, and you never saw D before. And so that's the type of experience that Simondon has in mind when he's describing sleep as having to do with invention. Maybe the other thing I'll mention here in relation to sleep is, so he earlier described invention, or he related invention to these sort of metamorphoses, or these moments of de-differentiation. So of course, in the life of certain organisms like insects or crustaceans, they undergo these metamorphoses where the whole organism is sort of transformed in its structure. You think of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. So it sort of destructures its body and then restructures it into a new structure. And then likewise in our mental life, nighttime is a kind of destructuring, where we might have dreams that are sort of disjointed and disconnected and have no particular relevance to the situation where we find ourselves. And then when we wake up, our mental life is structured in a different way, and suddenly we know how to solve a problem that we didn't know how to solve the day before. And so this is sort of how Simondon sees sleep and nighttime as having to do with this moment of destructuring or de-differentiation that brings about a new structure. Oh, yes. Let me... okay, you should be able to unmute yourself, I think. You're not server muted. It says suppressed. Interesting. Okay, let me just try. I'll try server mute and then unserver mute and see if that does anything. Okay, yeah, it looks like you were able to unmute yourself. Would you like to read, let's see, section 2, or subsection 2, and then subsection 3 as well. It's a short one. If you could read those two subsections, please. I'm not sure if you're speaking, but I can't hear you. Yeah, it says you're unmuted, but I can't hear anything from you. Okay. Yeah, maybe we can try to figure that out for next time, and see if you can do that for next time. I'll read the next section or subsection. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the French text. It probably would be better if I read it in English. Let's see. Right, life as a cycle of the genesis of images. If life is compared to a day in which youth would be mourning, it is because the character of unlimited freedom of motor power, the principle of anticipation, is common to both. The development of the individual discloses a plurality of powers that constitute so many postulates of the encounter with the object, so many anticipations of life situations imagined according to the contours of desire, at the same time that it shows those powers as successively diverging from a common origin. In the élan of a young being, unlimited will projects the envelope of all possible realities over an entire lifetime. Later, as reality is experienced as limit and obstacle, the sheaf of potentially projected actions becomes diffuse, reflected, or refracted. The object emerges within an organization whose perspective does not always prolong that of the anticipating project. In the best case of successful adaptation to maturity, there is partial parallelism between the order of events and the activity of the subject. The subject organizes his relation to reality like a territory where all is not yet constructed, willed, premeditated, done according to plan, but where construction plans take account of the given. The image the subject has of his activity and even of his projects is the reflection of a situation, which implies a reference to the real and to a preponderance of cognitive elements. The twilight of life, when the subject partially renounces situated activity, foregrounds symbol images, acquiring, in the form of honors and titles, a social dimension, but also a subjective resonance as well as a magical power of self-consciousness as a means of post facto communication and re-evocation of the fundamental actions of life, of a life. To go to the end of the analogical hypothesis, we might say that old age corresponds to the possibility of invention and renewal. This is not the case in our societies, yet in antiquity, the prophetic role of the older man or woman came in excess of the possession of wisdom as fruit of a long experience. Patriarchs knew how to lead their tribe to the promised land. The ongoing devaluation of the status of the elderly correlates with a weakening of prophetic modes of collective thought and of the official and public uses of divination, replaced by a plurality of practical planning. Subsection 3. Imagination and the seasons. In temperate regions, and even more so in circumpolar ones, collective life has been and continues to be affected by a reaction to the seasons, either according to the rhythm of agricultural labor or the alternation of work and leisure. Most has shown the way in which Inuit life changes when the long polar night brings back collective life with its rites and ceremonies, while summer is the time of isolation and individual activity corresponding to a positive vision of the world. In our mythology, spring is a time of renewal, desire, energy, and projects. Summer, that of the realism of work, of action being accomplished at the noontime of the year, when fields are at their fullest. Then with fall, action relaxes, the year gets old, work is totalized in the form of harvest. The year was good or it was bad, but it has been consummated. And so the memory of the dead is evoked. Finally, winter's dormancy brings the expectation of a rebirth, like a night between 2 days. In the past, the year began with Easter, the morning of the annual cycle. In France, August 15th is comparable to noon, midlife in its full maturity. It is the culmination registered in the poetic image, Noon, King of Summers. The mythology of seasons recoups that of the ages of life and the hours of the day, because all these cycles have more or less deeply synchronized the genesis of images and are seen through the temporary predominance of one of the 3 phases of the cycle of images. Right, so these are the next 2 cycles, the next 2 natural cycles that Simondon wants to correlate with his cycle of images. So the cycle of life from youth to adulthood to old age, and then finally, from youth to adulthood to old age, and then the next cycle is the cycle of the seasons, where we have spring as the sort of youth of the year, and then the summer as the adulthood of the year, or the center of the year, and then fall as the sort of old age or the evening of the year. And I think, so he's drawing here on a lot of sort of standard poetic images, and he refers to some specific poems, but there's this sort of identification of these cycles across each other. So we think of youth as the morning of life, and spring as the youth of the year, and so on. So these images sort of correlate these cycles with each other, and they kind of identify moments of one cycle with moments of the other cycle. And so Simondon sees his cycle of images as being connected to this correlation between these cycles that we see in sort of poetic usage and in maybe folk songs or legends and so on. So these are he's drawing essentially on standard poetic imagery to make these identifications here.
It's interesting that, the phase corresponding to imagination happens in some of these. There's a corresponding phase in some of these cycles, but not in others. I know he said earlier that imagination was too unstable to serve as a paradigm. And I think we kind of talked about this in a previous session, but I wonder if the idea is that imagination is contingent. Seems like you can always find phases of these cycles to correspond to the a priori, a presenti, and a posteriori, but there isn't necessarily a corresponding phase for invention. So the reorganization may or may not happen depending on the type of the cycle, or I don't know, maybe on other conditions as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's a good observation. So if we think of the cycle of seasons, for example, of course, winter always happens. For those of us who live in temperate parts of the world, we always have this cycle from spring, summer, fall, and then winter. But the winter season doesn't necessarily, there isn't anything sort of necessarily inventive about the winter. You might spend the winter more or less, hibernating, and then come back in the spring with, just doing the same thing as you did the previous year. If we're thinking of a sort of agricultural context, you do your sowing in the spring. The winter you might spend on, repairs and other sort of tasks that you didn't have time for in the rest of the year, but you might not invent anything new, or you might not really undergo any transformation over the course of the winter. And so there's a difference here with these natural cycles. There's no sort of inherent forward movement or spiraling structure of the cycle in the way that there is in the cycle of invention that he describes. The cycle just sort of returns to its starting point, and it doesn't necessarily change anything or undergo any transformation. Whereas in the cycle of images, or in the cycle of the genesis of images for Simondon, we have this spiraling structure where each iteration of the cycle is at a higher level than the previous one. So this would be a sort of traditional distinction between the domains of nature and the domains of the human. That the natural world always sort of proceeds in cycles that return to the starting points, and then the human world has this sort of forward movement to it. I'm not sure if Simondon wants to take on board, all the consequences of that distinction, but that's one way we could try to interpret this distinction between the cycle of invention, or the cycle of the images that has this invention phase, and the natural cycles that seem to return to the same starting point. Okay, so if there's no other questions or comments, let's read the last subsection of the introduction, so subsection 4. If someone could read the whole subsection for us.
I'd go again. 4. The cycle of images and the becoming of civilizations. Taking another step toward the collective character of the genesis of images, we may wonder whether the notion of cycle might not allow us to account for the succession of stages manifested in the continuous development of the content of cultures. Expressions such as the dawn of Greek science or the twilight of the idols appear to take for granted that analogical metaphors of day and night, youth and old age, apply to some degree to the historical succession of stages, archaic or primitive, classic, then decadent, through which various cultural modalities pass, without any necessary coincidence, moreover, between the evolving modalities, religions, arts, etc. This probably means that the cultural forms subjected to cyclical becoming are those that imply a strong charge of mental images. The pure sciences do have a birth, but they are more progressive, cumulative, as Pascal indicates, when he compares humanity to a single person, always learning and never forgetting. By contrast, processes of growth and maturity, then decline, correspond directly to the common trove of images that constitute cultures and serve as norms for individual knowledge and action. In the succession of primitive, classic, and decadent phases, we find two dominant traits. The first is the predominance in the primitive phase of a priori images oriented towards action, celebrating the act, the feat, and leading to initiatory or esoteric knowledge with elevated values, within a logic of participation. Such a culture has aristocratic and sacred dominance, like the art of Pindar or Aeschylus, or the medieval chanson de geste. They concentrate the glory of heroes and inspire high deeds, such as the poems of Tiresias. Having become classical, a culture finds the images of legend in current and common situations, always present in life, as the sense of everyday human relationships. Culture is desacralized and tends towards the deepened hic et nunc we call the universal. Rather than celebrating great feats or the forces of action, that culture provides the spectacle of action as it unfolds, and it is realist because its modality is the fully actualized present. Finally, the post-classical period seeks intense and poignant emotive affective images. Art is no longer a spectacle but a substitute for reality, in the form of symbols as pseudo-objects. Cultural forms are decoupled from real life, like a double that masks it. Aesthetic values become dominant and constitute a complete universe, a subjective achievement. It is the era of the novel, romanticism, the imaginary as a second reality, according to a logic of identification. In other words, archaic cultures are centered on action in a perspective of projection into the future. Classical cultures mold perceptions and are essentially plastic, builders of a real object, while cultures in decline, rather than inciting action or shaping perceptions of an ordered and arranged but not doubled reality, produce a universe of images that dress and mask the world without adhering to it. And aesthetics is thereby created. That is, not a way of perceiving, but a manner of experiencing images brought about by art, or even a way of considering the world as a reservoir of images. Everything in the world that triggers a fissure, ruin, historical look, allure historique, allows an escape from perception in order to enter into an emotive affective universe. Symbols acquire meaning within the perspective of an imaginary past life. Aesthetic art, in contrast to the plastic arts, consigns what it produces to the past. It creates ruins. It is this image-producing art which Plato chased from the polis. Action, perception, and symbolic memories are thus the three fundamental modalities of the content of images that constitute the basis of cultures, and therefore differ from the sciences, since the third stage is not that of positivity, which Auguste Comte discovered in the law of the three stages. Knowledge is progressive and continuous, whereas cultures, after each cycle, break apart, change structure, and reemerge according to new principles.
Yeah, this bit is again another cycle, not a natural cycle this time, but this cycle of civilizations. This is a very, again, traditional image. We talk about the dawn of civilization, or the this sort of progression of phases between a sort of archaic and then classical and then post-classical phase, or people talk about the golden age of Greek literature or Russian literature or whatever, and then a sort of decline or maybe a silver age, which is not quite at the same level as the golden age and so on. So we have these images that we use in relation to the development of the arts, especially, but civilizations in sort of the broad sense of the term. And Simondon suggests that this sort of cyclical nature or this cyclical structure is something that we find especially in relation to images, in insofar as a particular domain of life is structured in this imagistic way. It's going to be more susceptible to development in terms of these cycles of the images, and so the arts in particular are, of course, productive of images in various ways, and so it's for that reason that the arts sort of undergo this cyclical development from an archaic to a classical to a post-classical phase. And again, this sort of cycle is tied or correlated to the other cycles where we talk about the youth of a civilization or the youth of a particular art movement, and then we tie that to the dawn of Greek art or whatever, and then we compare. We talk about the maturity of a particular art tradition. Again, so this is comparing it to the life cycle of a human being. So we make all these correlations between all these different cycles, and so yeah, that's sort of the type of cycle that Simondon has in mind here. And again, he's drawing on sort of traditional images of the cycle of civilizations or the cycle of phases in the development of an art form.
Yeah, I wonder if there was that, I posted in the chat that obscure reference to aestheticism in Individuation Volume 1. And I wonder if he had something like this in mind, the characterization of the a posteriori phase of civilization, I guess, where there's the aesthetic relationship to civilization is just sort of a decoration, and it's purely oriented towards the past. It doesn't have the projective and sort of futural orientation of the heroic poetry that he associates with the earliest phase of civilization. So, maybe what is wrong with aestheticism in this section in Volume 1 is that it's purely past oriented, and it is only iterative because it can't sort of orient itself towards the new.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that passage up, because yes, I think this text does definitely help to clarify what he's talking about in Individuation, where he just sort of makes, and this is in the conclusion, I believe, of Individuation, where he just sort of makes this allusion to aestheticism, and then he hasn't really talked about anything like aestheticism throughout the rest of the text, and he just sort of alludes to aestheticism in the conclusion, and he sort of expects us to know what he's talking about, whereas of course we don't really know what he's talking about. But so here again we can think of this cycle as having to do with the extent to which the phases are inserted into a situation. So in the archaic phase, so he's thinking here of like Homer, Pindar. I think he's drawing this especially from the history of Greek art and literature. But yeah, so people like Homer or Pindar, they are expressing these sort of noble deeds that are sort of calls for other people to imitate these deeds and to perform new noble deeds. So you don't read the Iliad or listen to the Iliad recited, to have an aesthetic experience, but you listen to it, or the practice of reciting the Iliad is meant to instill a love for honor and glory and so on in the youth, and to elicit noble deeds from the youth in future. So there's a whole practice of the sort of reception of this form of art that has to do with inciting to action. And then the second phase, the classical phase, we can think of people like Sophocles, maybe he might have in mind, or people that have this sort of direct encounter with the world. So they understand, they're using these sort of legendary sources, like there were the legendary sources for Oedipus and so on that Sophocles is using. But they're understood in relation to contemporary life. They're sort of transposed into the contemporary world of third or fourth century Athens. So you only ever so the use of these images now has to do with a sort of interaction with the world and an understanding of the reality that the people are living in. And then the third phase, I'm not sure if there's a sort of direct equivalent in the Greek literary, in the history of Greek literature or Greek art, but this third phase, this aesthetic phase, and he uses here the term romanticism as a sort of synonym for this, but it's a kind of understanding of art as being productive of experiences. So it's not that art sort of creates or modulates reality or creates something in the world. It's the art serves to create experiences, and this is especially a romantic. If we look at passing over a few thousand years, but we look at the romanticism, properly speaking, at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. This conception was sort of predominant in the self-understanding of a lot of the authors that we now think of as romantics, that art serves to produce an emotional response, and that's primarily the purpose of art, is to produce that emotional response in the audience. And Simondon alludes here to this practice of constructing ruins, which is kind of I think he sees it as kind of silly or kind of artificial, but this was something that 18th and 19th century gentlemen would have, like fake Roman ruins constructed on their country properties, and it, looking at this ruin in your nice little garden, produces an experience of sort of nostalgia for the past or whatever. But anyway, this artistic construction of the ruin serves only to produce a certain emotion in the viewer. It doesn't have a capacity to elicit action in the same way that the Iliad does. And so I think Simondon, in this text, in Imagination and Invention, he doesn't really seem to give any value judgments to these different phases, or not a direct value judgment, but he in individuation, he definitely criticizes aestheticism, or he sees it as a kind of decadence, I guess, where we have this sort of removal from reality, and we only think of art and the production of art as having to do with generating experiences or eliciting emotions in the audience. And I think Simondon sees this as a kind of degeneration of art, or as something that sort of limits the capacity of art to have an effect on human life, whereas there are other aspects of art, like the capacity to elicit action, that are not grasped by this sort of formulation of romanticism or aestheticism.
Yeah, I think that example of the ruins in the in the garden is also a great way to think about the difference between iteration and repetition, which he brings up in the conclusion to Volume 1. And I think he associates it with aestheticism. If I remember correctly, the idea of the wild act as something that is only iterable but not repeatable. And I think that repetition involves some kind of creative transformation. But, if you're just reconstructing what the ruins of something look like in your garden, you're, I think, very far from repeating the original impetus of the creation of that thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd have to go back to that conclusion passage because it is quite dense, and I think it makes a lot more sense, having read this passage in Imagination and Invention, to go back to that passage and try to make sense of it. So like the act of repeating, the Romans didn't build ruins; they built bridges and colosseums and so on. So if you're active sort of if you wanted to sort of do what the Romans did, you would build a new bridge. You wouldn't like build a ruin of a bridge that sort of looks like a Roman bridge or something like that. You would actually construct something new, because that's what the Romans did in their time. They constructed something new. So I think that helps to make sense of that distinction between iteration and repetition. So iteration would just be sort of re-evoking the past or producing an experience of pastness or something like that, as opposed to repetition, which is performing a new act that sort of takes up the content of the old act, building a new bridge, the same way that the Romans did in their time. Oh, and one bit of translation that, or one thing doesn't come across quite as well in the translation is that, so he says that the aesthetic phase, this third phase, is the era of the novel, romanticism. So in French, a novel is a roman. So and then romanticism is romanticisme. So there's a direct etymological connection between the word for novel and the word for romanticism. The connection might be clearer in French than in English, but the sort of popularization of novel writing and reading largely, or to some extent at least, coincides with Romanticism in Europe, where novels, so this is like late 18th to early 19th century, where novels have this role of eliciting experiences in the reader. You're supposed to be sort of moved to tears or to laughter or whatever when you read a novel. And this is sort of what a novel is supposed to be for, is to produce these experiences in the reader. And so this moment of this era of the novel is precisely the era of Romanticism. Okay, I had said that we should do a shorter session today. We went a little bit longer than I expected, but I think this is a good place to stop, because we're right at the end of the introduction, and then we can go on to part 1 next time, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for your contributions, and hopefully we can get some of these mic issues sorted out for next time, and then everyone can participate fully. All right, so see you all next week.